This is Klank Diolosa, and you're listening to Discography Discussion.
You're listening to Discography Discussion, episode 174, Believer, with Klank Diolosa of Klank.
I just could not retain my colon at that point. It was just all bets were off.
And that's the opening of the show. Hosted by Dan Terry.
All right, bitch.
And Joseph Wren. Ah! Presented by discussmetal.com. And if Thor dropped his hammer and Klank moved it, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion. I am Joe. That is Dan. Klank Diolosa is here. We're talking about Believer.
Yes, we are.
This is exciting. This is a hard band to talk about because I just want to be like, it's good, all of it, great, it's all great. Check it all out. You're gonna love it. Don't even worry about it. End of show, right? But I think there isn't a band whose impact on thrash metal or metal in general that, you know, it may not be a band that a lot of people at large have heard, and that's kind of a travesty.
I agree. But the good thing is the fact that when they got on Metal Blade for a while and were releasing stuff, that helped jump them into a whole different audience and just a bigger distro. You know, I guess I'm kind of jumping ahead by saying that, but I mean, look, the humble beginnings on REX back in the day, I mean, when those albums came out, they just smashed you in the face heavy. That's just what it was. And for me, you know, just because growing up, I was not allowed to have anything in the house unless it was Christian. That was my parents. So it was like, I'd go to my cousin Lance's house, and I'd show up at his house with like Stryper and Sandy Patty album covers, and he would give me like Dokken and Sabbath, and Pelletary, and just, you know, all kinds of heavy stuff, King Diamond, Merciful Fate, and, you know, it was just, hearing that stuff for the first time, just, it floored me because, you know, like I said, I was only allowed to listen to like the stuff that my parents approved of. And even then it was like, oh, these guys look like girls. This can't be Christian. You know, look at them. They wear makeup. And it was like, dude, make up your mind. They got Christian lyrics. What the hell do you want? You know? But dude, the music was just, it was so heavy, and it spoke volumes to me, you know, just because of, and how technically advanced it was, the musicianship, the songwriting. Oh man, dude, I don't know. It's just, that's why I said they were just one of those bands that excited me, and I was like, man, I kind of play guitar, but that listening to that was like, I gotta practice, and I need to practice every day, just because I wanted to be able to be on that level. And it took me, I can't even tell you how long it took me, but after a while, I was like, oh man, okay, I got the, you know, the down picking hand, wrist going. And then, you know, even they say never meet your heroes, never meet your idols, but having met those guys and spent some time with them over the years and then bumping into them here and there, was like, they were always cool. There was, you know, Kurt was always genuine. Joey was always cool. You know, we even got Kevin to do a solo on our song Manipulation on our Rise album. So it was like, even to this day, they're still cool, down-to-earth dudes that just write killer music. And I just hope that, you know, they keep putting out their installments of the newer stuff, just so other people can still see what they're doing. You know what I'm saying? Like, especially like I hate to use the term younger generation, but the people who might not know about them, that stumble upon them and they go, oh man, this is like a diamond in the rough. You know, all that stuff was. I mean, dude, look, orchestrations back in the day with like the violins and the violas and the cellos and all that mixed with the thrash. Nobody was doing it. It was so ahead of the curve, you know? And then when you throw the operatic vocals on top of it, dude, that was just like, stick a fork in me, I'm done. You know, it's like, I was like, you can't get any cooler than this.
And I was one of those people. I was not aware of Believer as a band until sometime in the mid-2000s. In my guitarist journey, they're not a band that was ever on my radar, but then I hear them, and the question becomes, what are they doing that's not as good as what Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth did? Extraction from Mortality, the first record, which we're not there yet, but I'm hearing it, so I'm going to talk about it. It's straight ahead thrash onslaught. Play fast, have a good time, guys, and we're going to bark at the mic. I'm here.
Exactly.
I'm in.
And you know what? I think the only difference between them and the Metallicas and all that stuff was the size of the label that they were on. You know what I'm saying? If they would have been on like Elektra or something like that at the time, I think they would have been huge.
Well, they weren't small. I know coming out on Rex, that's kind of a smaller label. I've actually got almost a complete set of all of the REX recordings. Like I have almost every single one of them on cassette now. There's just just a few that I'm missing, but I'm trying to just collect the set, But that was actually one of the best record labels back then for. Especially if you're into Christian music, it had pretty much all of the bands. This is pre-Tooth and Nail, pre-Solid State, pre all of that stuff, And this record absolutely blew me away. Just being, it's not just thrash. That's the thing. Like Joe, you were asking, what is different about this over, like a Metallica or a Slayer? I think it's the level of playing, the level of technicality on display, even on that first record. It's like tech thrash, it's like they're thinking with different numbers than we're thinking with.
Yes, absolutely. And don't forget the stories in the past about how when they were writing some of their albums, like some songs, they were working on songs and they weren't sure what to do with some parts, and they basically would roll dice. And like there's one song in particular, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's on Dimensions. It's a and basically they would roll the dice, and depending on what number, they had like a chart, and whatever number it landed would be whatever note they would play. And I mean, it sounds so bizarre and so like Dungeons and Dragons-y, but it made the songs that much even more like man, a song that was already kind of killer. When you heard the story behind it, like how they came up with some of this stuff, it was like, who does that? Who does that? They do. And it was awesome,
Absolutely. Yeah, that first one was probably one of the first records I heard from Believer. No, I didn't hear it back in 1989 because I would have been 3.
Well, you would have
3 or 4 years old, and I would love for all of our listeners to think that, yes, I listened to that when I was 3, but I did not.
Yeah, 3-year-old Dan called me and said, "Hey, dude, check this out."
Well, I was talking about, I was recently on the As the Story Grows podcast, and I was talking about how I had gotten into this type of metal somewhat later on in life, almost after high school, and how I had crammed 30 years of metal history into just like 6 months. And so Believer was one of the first bands from the earlier era that I checked out, and so I started at the beginning with Extraction, and I'd never heard anything like it. I mean, because like you go back and you listen to a lot of the bands that were out at the time that they were, and they're just doing something completely off the wall. There's no Christian music comparison chart with a band like Believer. There's no, if you like Metallica, you like this. Well, maybe, but maybe not. And so I think even throwing it into the category of thrash is almost a disservice. Like, it definitely is thrash metal, but it's so much more than that, just in the composition itself. And that's really what drew me to Extraction. And then obviously when Sanity came out, it was almost on a completely different level.
Yeah, it was like these guys were already ahead of the scene, because they didn't, like you said, they didn't sound like anybody else. So they put out this killer debut album, and the sophomore curse. Is it just as good as the first one? Is it worse? Is it better? They put out Sanity. Now, Extraction will just always be my all-time favorite Believer album, just because it was, so monumental at the time. But every album after that progressed. Even with like Sanity Obscure, it was just like, man, you upped your game. You did this. You changed it around a little bit. And then Dimensions, it was like, a little bit more with like, the audio samples and the avant-garde technical thrash-esque-ness of it. You know what I'm saying? Where it was just like, they didn't want to be put in a box. It wasn't just, it didn't sound like Death. It didn't sound like Testament or Nuclear Assault. They sounded like themselves. And that was one of the things that, because they stood out, because they didn't sound like anybody else. And that's what drew people to them and drew me to them. And just, I don't know, even like, man, what the heck? I'm trying to remember now. On the demo, have you guys ever heard the Believer demo?
I have never heard it. I haven't been able to get a hold of it. I mean, I'm sure I could find it on Google, but
I'm trying to remember. They had that one song that was on there, which was kind of like a nod to Metallica. It was like, I forget, because I'm not the biggest Metallica fan. It started off dun 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 dun. Okay, yeah. Sounded like kind of very Metallica-esque, but it was just insane. And because Clayton actually had it, so he's the one that I had originally heard it from, and it was just like, dude, what the hell is this? Like, and he's like, dude, this is Believer. It's these guys from Pennsylvania, blah blah blah. And ironically, Kurt Bachman is the one who got Clay signed as Circle of Dust to REX. He's the one who brought them into the fold. He's the one who brought him into the fold because Kurt kind of became like a rep, an East Coast rep for REX Records.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and speaking of REX Records and cassettes, did somebody say something about 1992 REX Records
nice.
First edition?
Oh, damn.
I have that.
Not even the re-release, the original.
No, mine is the original. It's not the one he re-recorded. It was the original version. It's funny too because there used to be a lot of debate. I'm sorry, Joe, this is off topic, but there used to be this debate, early on in the early days of the internet, like, is that a re-recorded record or is it people couldn't remember because there were two versions of it. They looked identical, but one says 1992 and one says 1995, and that's how you can tell whether you've got, and they sound different. It's different track listing and things like that. But that's just a little COD. Little tidbit there.
COD REX correlation.
Absolutely. Well, and this is the big thing. So when Sanity Obscure came out, it was released initially by REX, and then all of a sudden Roadrunner picks the band up, which, Roadrunner in 1990 was basically becoming, I think it was like them and Earache had like the best bands.
Yes. That's right. It was Roadrunner. I said Metal Blade before, but I think they ended up on. I think they did a short stint on Metal Blade later on in their career, right?
Yeah, they did. The newer albums were on Metal Blade.
Yeah.
But yeah, to get picked up by Roadrunner that early into their career, I mean, somebody saw what we're talking about as far as this band being, and this is right before death metal like really started to hit.
Yeah.
So you had bands like Believer that were still like becoming rising stars in that scene because they were playing something new and something different. And so this record, I feel like, number one, it sounds better because, like, I have both of these records on tape. I actually don't have the CDs. Not because, like, I'm a huge tape guy. It's just I just have them from years ago. And it could just be my tapes, but this record, like, the production value, the way it was recorded and everything, 10 times what it was on Extraction.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm trying to remember... I have a Believer trivia sort of thing. I can't remember if the name of the song is Tormented or if it's from Extraction. I don't remember if it's Tormented or Blemish Sacrifices. If you listen to Telltale Crime by Circle of Dust, that whole that wasn't played. That was sampled from the first Believer album, played backwards, cut up and manipulated by Clayton to make the main riff, which is Telltale Crime. That's
interesting.
Most people don't know that. It's the one that... Oh man, of course I'm totally brain farting right now. I can't remember if it's Blemish Sacrifices or it might be Blemish Sacrifices, but yeah. Dude, again, I could not find anything that had that tone back in the day, that Extraction tone. Like, you could put any other thrash album or heavy metal album that came out at that point, and it was just better. A lot of it was better. And you were talking about a little indie label from Nashville. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was like, how did these guys pull this out of their hat? But they did.
Yeah, it's just finding the right bands. And I mean... With Believer, it's hard because, again, all I really want to tell people is, dude, if you haven't heard Believer, like, what are you doing with your life if you're into heavy music? Yeah, I mean, it took us 3 years to finally, talk about them on the show because I've always gone back and forth with like, how do I do this episode without just being a total fanboy and just being like, dude, they've never put out anything bad. It's there's nothing to criticize. I know that's like a lot of what we do on the show is criticize, but there's not a lot to criticize. So with Sanity Obscure, like that record just absolutely blew me away. It's probably my favorite of the two early ones.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that once Dimensions came out, it was all over, man. It was like game over. Like, not in a bad way, but like this is what all this has been leading up to. Yeah,
exactly. And just they upped the game with the orchestrations on that. Like I said, with the audio clips and samples, it was just so brilliantly done. I mean, Kurt and Joey made such a great writing combo, a good partnership. You know, it just goes to show how the music stands up over the test of time. To this, I mean, here we are, 30-something years now, and we're here talking about them because they're that good, you know?
Yeah, the intro for Dimensions is one of the craziest things I've ever heard, and that's just Gone. It's called Gone.
Yeah.
I was driving down here earlier, and I had my daughter in the car, and I started playing this album, and I kept kind of looking in the rearview mirror, just kind of getting kind of a vibe of what she was thinking as she was hearing all these sounds. And she kept kind of looking around, like, and then like at one point she like laughed, and then she stopped laughing, like when the riff started coming in, and then whenever she heard Kurt's voice, she was just like, "Oh, what's going on here?" I mean, and I drive around with her to listen to heavy music all the time, but this was so uniquely different sounding and created such a vibe that even a little kid can listen to it and be like, there's something very different about this, and I can't quite put my finger on it.
Absolutely.
I think the biggest elephant in the room as far as this album goes is the Trilogy of Knowledge that ends it all off, which was their big orchestral. I mean, I don't like using this word because it's cheesy, but I mean, it's a straight up masterpiece.
Sorry, I'm stuck on cat litter duty. I know that's not really metal.
That's fine.
It's heavy in its own respect.
It is if you grinded it yourself by chewing it up into little tiny bits.
There you go.
Gritty kitty.
Stupid.
I'm assuming because of the age gap and because you said you were 3 when it came out, you probably never got to see them live, did you?
I did not. No.
Absolutely not.
You got me.
I have this thing called YouTube. I pulled it up once and watched the band play live. It was great.
I tell you what, and pull up on like Believer live at Cornerstone. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Basically, because Scott Liard, I forgot how to pronounce his name. Liard was the violinist, and he was a music teacher. And they did a gig at Cornerstone, and they basically brought his entire music class to do all the orchestrations live. Now you have, they're all dressed fancy and stuff, and then you got these dudes in like white t-shirts with like ripped up denim jeans coming out. It was just such a contrast, but it was the stuff that folklore is written about. You know what I'm saying? Like it's amazing. I mean, it's too bad that none of the footage was actually like professionally recorded or whatever, but it is great footage. And I saw them in Manhattan. It was on like it was in a commercial building on like the 3rd or 4th floor. Everybody was jumping and pogoing, and I remember my buddies going, "Dude, we are going to fall through the floor and into whatever's underneath us." It was that insane, and that was when Extraction from Mortality came out. They played the entire album, and I was in my teens, and it was just, like I said, life altering for me. It was just like, the Holy Grail.
See, I love watching the old school thrash bands play shows where the tape just doesn't look very good because it reminds me of classic 80s thrash. And then I listen to the record. It's 1993. It's Dimensions. It sounds like thrash metal didn't stop. And I know Metallica was about to say, guess what, guys? We're going to be Alice in Chains this year. And Slayer would make a similar decision a few years later. But what was the reason, if we know it? Why did this band stop making music?
Believer itself was, I think it was, well, the music business side always bites people. Plus, Kurt was heavily involved in like a trauma unit. Like he was, hence the nickname Trauma Team. That was him and Joey's production. But Kurt is actually like extremely well educated, worked in like a trauma unit, you know, and basically does like genetic research, cancer research and stuff like that. Like the dude is just, he's brilliant. And the best part about it is when somebody who's of that nature, who's like an Einstein kind of guy, but also so musically gifted. And on top of that, when you talk to them, and you talk to him in particular, he's got the just total mellow, down to earth vibe. It was like, man, why aren't these guys huger? Why are they not living on a bus, touring for 3 years at a clip? And, you know, times change, you know, it gets to a point where it's weird. It was easier back in the day to make money, to make a living, I guess you could say, if it was done right. But now, if you think with the explosion of the internet and the MP3 digital age, and now the streaming, you'd think, because there's so much more avenues to get your music out now, you think that it would be so much easier for bands to sustain themselves just doing music. But that's actually farthest from the truth, unless you already are a big established artist. If you're already a big established artist and you're, you know, doing stuff DIY, whatever, and just licensing it through, you know, not signing to a label, but licensing for distro and stuff, you can stand to make so much more money. And it just sucks that they were one of those bands that were, you know, after grueling touring for years and stuff, they just, you know, they had to have other jobs to sustain their living. And then, you know, life happens. You know, people get married, have kids or whatever. Life kind of gets in the way, so to speak. But I'm just so glad they're still around. You know, it might be in dribs and drabs, but they're still around.
Yeah, there was a pretty big gap after Dimensions where we just kind of assumed the band was gone completely, and there was never going to be. I know there was a little bit of controversy. I think a record label, I think it was Retroactive, re-released the earlier albums, and they released a bunch of bonus tracks of like demo versions or incomplete versions of the songs. And I remember Kurt getting on and getting like really, I mean, he wasn't like a jerk about it, but he was just like, man, you know, I really wish people hadn't heard these, because he was so meticulous about his music and about the presentation to the fans that he was like, man, I don't want people to hear my garbage takes and you know, things like that. And I remember really feeling bad, but I remember the thing that was really important about this, and not necessarily that, you know, that he was talking about it, but the fact that I was like, oh, he's engaging now about Believer stuff. I wonder what that's all about. And then before we know it, Believer's back. They're on Metal Blade and they're putting out a new album.
Yeah, that's right, because then Gabriel came out. And Gabriel was the first one after the extended hiatus. And I liked Gabriel. Gabriel was cool. Even, you know, they had Howard from Killswitch sing a song with them. And then I dig Gabriel, because like I said, I'll always like everything Believer does, but Extraction, you know, all-time favorite. But all those years later, after Gabriel, like when Transhuman hit, there's just something about that album too, where it was just, Kurt was singing a little higher. It's weird too, because usually when people are younger, their vocal register's higher, and then as you get older, it gets a little lower. You know, you look at like Metallica, some of those bands like that. But Kurt, you look at like the later stuff, it seemed like his vocal register was a little higher.
Yeah,
and that's something I remember I had that album. I burnt the CD when I was living up in the mountaintop with my ex-wife, and I don't know, it was like 6-8 months. I didn't take it out of my CD player. I listened to it every day, because it was just one of those albums that's so, I don't know, perfect-esque, you know, where you didn't have to bother taking it out. You didn't have to skip any songs. It was one of those albums that I could just go through and be like, oh, this is so great. This is so great. This is so great. You know, and even to this day, that's like I said before, it just goes to show the longevity as musicians, songwriters, and even like their studio skills, you know. Just, yeah, I wish some of the newer bands today had the drive and the hunger that like Believer had when they came out. Because when they came out, they came out of the gate kicking, you know. And it was like there was other stuff, you know. You had like, you know, later on like the Deliverances and Vengeance and all that stuff, and it was cool. But I think also the East Coast and West Coast difference, because West Coast thrash was, you know, like I said, like Vengeance, Deliverance, but that down home East Coast vibe, you know, kind of like the, you know, the New York hardcore scene, you know, like certain movements, certain sounds. It's like you just can't hold a candle to it, you know.
It was like less flash, I guess, so to speak. Because like you look at a band like Deliverance, and I mean, obviously I love Deliverance also, but they were a little bit more of like a stage band, like a, you know, like a huge thing. It's not that Believer wasn't a full on production, especially later on as they went, but yeah, whenever they started, they just had, I don't know, the music just always came across as a little bit more serious, I guess. I don't know, like down to earth, even though musically it was on another planet, you know.
It was more honest because it was that young angst, that you know, aggression of youth. That's what I feel anyway, you know, because like when you put on that stuff, dude, it's like, man, just listening to those riffs and stuff. So I just have vivid flashbacks of like playing handball with my friend Dan at the park with the giant boombox with this playing, and people who they were all only into like Metallica, Suicidal Tendencies, and whatever. They would be like, dude, what is this stuff? It was cool. And it was like they had no clue that it was like, you know, had uplifting, positive lyrics or introspective, thought-provoking lyrics, you know?
Yeah. I appreciate how old school this record sounds. This came out in 2009. I was complaining about bands that make way more money than I ever will, releasing records that will sell many more copies than any record I have been a part of will ever sell, in theory. And the records sound thin and artificially digital and just overall don't sound good.
Yeah.
And then King Diamond decides he's going to put out Midnight. And it sounds like a record that came out in the 80s but was recorded on a MacBook, because the guitars are very clean. They're very much modeled. It sounds like a record that was made on the cheap, but it didn't sound as bad as some of those other albums that came out in the mid to late 2000s. This record sounds like a band from the 90s paid for studio time, and when the engineer tried to mix it like 2009, they said, no, dude, here, listen to this. And they hand him a copy of fucking Dimensions and say, it needs to sound like that.
Yes.
So
agreed.
it's just thin enough. And it doesn't try to be Firepower, which sounds like a heavy metal record that came out in 2018. It sounds like a band that just picked right back up where they left off. And that, to me, is so good in 2009, when they could have easily thrown in bass drops and so many other tricks of the trade.
Yeah. Well, because then you get caught up in the, I don't want to say trend, but the sound of the sounds of the times. You know what I'm saying? Like, because look, when like new metal hit, it was like, oh, this is kind of cool. There was some bands, you know, you had like Orgy and some other bands and whatever that did some cool stuff, but then everybody started to sound like, you know, Trust Company came out and was like, hey, do you like Linkin Park? Well, here's a even more commercialized version. We're going to call them Trust Company, and here is this. And not that stuff is bad per se, but it was that whole, you know, look, Linkin Park came out, got really popular, and then you had these kind of clone or similar sounding bands in the same genre. I mean, labels did that. All labels did that, you know, like, I mean, you know, Metallica's really big. Well, let's get this band that sounds like Metallica. Or, you know, Slipknot's is good, so we're going to get this other band that sounds kind of like them. It's just how the industry works. But some bands, like, they just stood out, and they didn't have that copycat vibe. And Believer was one of those ones that no matter how many bands tried to emulate them or feed off the influence of them, they could never really capture the same gloriness, you know what I'm saying, of the Believer albums, in my opinion.
Well, Klank, you mentioned Trust Company. Are you saying you've never tried to release an album with all whispered vocals?
think so. Not yet. Anyway. No, but you know, it's you know, sign of the times. Like you said, every band's putting in bass drops and this and that. It's just some labels, some bands, you can pull up an album and you can say, oh, this totally sounds like it was released in '99. This totally sounds like it's 2002. This totally sounds like it's 1918 or whatever. But you also, when labels and stuff started changing with the burst of the digital age, labels also said, well, we're not giving bands $30,000 to do an album anymore. We're not going to give a band $50,000 with a $30,000 marketing budget anymore. Now it was like, can you do this for like $1,000 or $3,000? Or, hey, I know a guy with a MacBook Pro in his house and an interface. Good, we're going to go record at his house. I mean, it just, you know, the pluses and the minuses of technological advancements. You know, it is what it is.
Well, and the home recording side of everything got so much better when everyone figured out how to do it. There was this gap where we were still figuring it out, but it was way cheaper than it would have been back in the mid to late 90s. But then you had major label bands recording records that, unless somebody tells me different, I can only assume were mixed badly on purpose because they were either trying to save money or they were trying to rebel against the MP3 pirating that was going on, insert name of peer-to-peer file transfer service.
Yeah, LimeWire.
Kazaa. Morpheus. I know too many names to be credible.
Yeah, you can still pirate music on SoulSeek, I think. I think that one's still around, going strong. Don't
You know, Klank, that's a really sick beard you got going on there.
Right? It's coughing all these weird names of peer-to-peer sites. It's awesome.
Pirate Bay. Pirate Bay.
I think that one's still around. I think I actually clicked on a Pirate Bay link one time, and then I got a letter from my cable company like the next day. They're like, don't go there. It was really funny.
Yeah, this might have been an error, but if it wasn't, we're watching.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah,
like,
we know.
I gotcha.
Yeah. We've assigned you your own personal FBI agent.
We're like the VeggieTales. We're watching everything you do.
I feel bad for that guy. I'd feel bad for that guy that had to watch all my web activity. Like, wow, this dude just watches old grainy footage of bands from the 90s like play for hours and hours and hours.
This one guy, he's got this huge beard and he's so metal.
Yeah. Well, and so Gabriel wasn't it though. I mean, and I think it was really smart of Metal Blade to pick them up. I think they realized, you know, kind of what they had, and I mean, they had obviously no problem returning as a band, and they didn't have to work their way up. They went right to Metal Blade, and I don't know if they're still with Metal Blade or not, but we did get another album by them. We did get another album by them called Transhuman in 2011.
Yes. That one's still, I still have the chipped CD in my car that, you know, now certain songs skip because it's been beaten to death for so many years. But dude, Transhuman, see, you touched on a good point. You said, like, we didn't hear anything from Believer at it for a while, and then all of a sudden it was like, boom, out now, Believer on Metal Blade. Not many bands have the longevity or the command, I guess you could say, the demand, where, okay, like most labels go, well, what was your last album? How many sales did you put out? What did you tour? You know, Believer didn't. They did tour a decent amount in the beginning, but as time went on, you know, they didn't tour as much. And then here you go, I was a band that pops out of nowhere with Gabriel, and then, you know, 3 years later, Transhuman comes out, and it was the same thing. Like, it wasn't cheaply done. You know, they spent a lot of time for the album covers, and I don't know if you've seen on YouTube, but they go through the makeup process, the model that they use to do the makeup for the album covers. It's cool. That, and even like the EP releases, the 2-song ones. It's like they're one of those bands that if you love them, you freaking love them. If you don't like them, you know, it's some people are never like, oh, I kind of like Believer. It's like, if you love them, you really love them, and you believe Believer, so to speak. And that's what, you know, Transhuman was for me, it was a great jump from, I just brain farted, Gabriel. It was a great jump from that, because it was like, hey, we're just reminding you, not only are we still here, we have all our chops in place. We still have all our songwriting in place. We still have our production, and we still kick ass as a group, you know?
Totally. And this one was kind of a marked departure from Gabriel. You know, it was a little bit more melodic vocals, a little bit more, I don't want to say like mainstream, because it's really not that either, because it's not like the songs are melodic, they're catchy, but they're not like tropey, I guess. You know, like they're not like cheesy melodic.
Yeah, it's not like a power pop ballad. It has like songs like Lie Awake. You can't not sing along with it, you know? Just, I don't know. Like I said, that stayed in my car for so long in the CD player, not coming out, because it almost seemed like every time I listened, I seemed to be picking up different things that I never noticed before. Whether it was like little guitar lines, little samples, sound bites, little things they did. It was layered so well that it was just, you know, it was constantly like a Pandora's box. You know, one of those things, every time you listen to it, you're like, wow, I never noticed that before. Wow, I never noticed that either. You know, and like you said, you know, not as thrashy, you know, but I think, first of all, there's only a handful of bands that can put out the same album. You know, Slayer is one of those bands. Not knocking Slayer, but Slayer is, you know, Slayer. They want to be, you know, if you look at their albums, they're very similar as far as, you know, like 6 super fast songs, maybe 1 or 2 like medium tempo ones, but it's always the same thing. With Believer, it was like you got to see the growth as musicians and songwriters, yet they didn't really, I don't want to say they didn't deviate from their sound, but they didn't tarnish their past by cheesing out, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Like, they advanced with the times, and when they wanted to bust out the heavy, they busted out the heavy, but they showed the maturity in songwriting and craftsmanship in what they did. And I just, you know, I'm a fan, so I can never say anything really bad about them, just because of, you know, every album stands on its own, from 30 something years ago for the Extraction, even to the, you know, the installment releases that they've had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, the installment releases have been interesting. I mean, we got 3 of them in 2017, and then we never got the other 2. And I would assume that this is not done through a label at all, as far as I can tell. I think this is all just them.
It's all them. And that was the thing, too, because they were saying, according to Kevin, he said that at the time, they weren't trying to find a label because they didn't want the pressure. They wanted to do things on their terms, like basically not have any restrictions or you know, this has to be done by a certain point. That's why they said, you know what, we're going to do this ourselves. We'll release it when it's all done. And they have, let's say, the 5 installments. Then they were talking about possibly bringing it to some labels. I know because of who they are and their sales and their discography, their, you know, the legend that is Believer, there will always be band labels and interest in them. It's just a matter of what label really likes them enough or interests them enough to make it worthwhile. Because, you know, this day, if you have good marketing, do DIY, you can make a lot of money. You can do pretty good if you have a bank account that you can draw off of for your marketing. You don't necessarily need a major unless it's like a co-op deal, like with, you know, Pavement or somebody just for distro. You know, you can stand to make a lot of money, but it's the same thing though, where no label's putting up $30,000 for you. Now you're putting up all the money. You're putting up the money. You're writing the songs. You have to manufacture it. You have to get everything in place, and then, you know, whatever your marketing budget and your marketing plan is going to be, labels want to know all that, even if they're just doing distro. Because even if they say, well, hey, we're just going to slap our label on it and get it into stores, they want to know that there's going to be some kind of return, you know? And so that's why, like, Kevin was like, yeah, well, you know, we'll see what happens. You know, we've had some people contact us. We're not really concerned with that right now because we're not following a set schedule or guideline. And look, it's evident. It's been a couple of years since we've gotten the last installment. But at the same point, they're not done. They've, you know, but actually, 3 of the guys work at Stout's Brewery now in Pennsylvania. So it's like, it's funny because I'm like, man, you guys are together on and off during the day. I'm like, all you need to do is get together a couple of nights during the week and, you know, lock it down, man, lock it down. And I was like, yeah, you know, we will when it's time. And that's one of the things I've come to appreciate from them is they're not, they're not rushing to beat a deadline. They're not like, every year, like clockwork, you have to have a release. They're like, hey, we're going to do it on our own. And if people are cool with it, cool. And if they're not cool with it, cool. Also, because they're trying to be true musicians as far as at the end of the day, they want to please themselves with it. They need to make themselves happy. And of course, you want other people to like the stuff and be happy as well. But it's not about that after a while, especially if you've been doing this for this long, and you've had that much longevity in the business, so to speak,
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you've got a band that never did anything that they didn't want to do.
Exactly.
All we hear day in and day out doing this show, listening to other shows, it's all these horror stories of, we had to do this because the label wanted us to do this, or, we were in this scene and we didn't want to be in this scene, or we had this happen, or we got labeled as this, and we got, and with Believer, you just don't have a lot of that drama. Like I said, the only drama that they ever really had was Kurt being like, man, I really wish people didn't hear my outtakes. Like, that's not really, that's not really drama in the traditional sense.
And they used to do a lot of touring in Europe. And the thing is, like in Europe, they're big on beer. And I remember like the religious following freaking out on them. Ugh. There was pictures of them. They were drinking at a festival, and it was like, dude, that's one of the trappings of being labeled a Christian band in the religious music scene, whatever, is you have the people, you're human. So God forbid you smoke a cigarette. God forbid you have a beer or enjoy a drink, because some people, they think you have to be in this goody molded image. And that's not the case. People are humans, and I mean, I don't know who doesn't like beer, but,
right?
But at the same point, it's like their whole thing was like, hey, you know what? It's about the music first and foremost, and that's one of the reasons why to this day, Metal Blade and these other labels have the interest in them, is because they never caved in. They did things on their own terms, and people, like I said, either they loved them or hated them for it. Like a lot of those bands back in the day, they carried the flag. They got boycotted for, the drummer was smoking, or they had a couple of beers at the hospitality tent. I'm like, well, whatever. I mean, it's just stupid when people they try to tarnish the music or take away from the music because of something of that nature, and that's why, I don't know, that's why it's like, back in the day, it's not like when you had social media where everybody knows everything about everybody. They know how many ply toilet paper you use. They know what store you shop on. Back in the day, you had to wait for like Hit Parade or Metal Edge, Kerrang, or whatever to find out, what so-and-so says, or, here's what Kurt and Joey said in their interview. The interviews and stuff like that was few and far between. So there was more of the aura of mystery, like with celebrities and musicians and rock stars. Now it's like, I mean, it is what it is. It's the time. So you have Instagram and Facebook, and oh yeah, look at me at Costco, and I'm here and I'm there.
Right.
A little bit of the mystique of the rock stars and musicians or whatever is gone, because now everything is just so in your face. That was one of the purities back then, is because you always wanted to know more, but you had to wait to see what was going to be told, either in a magazine, a fanzine, even like those 7-page stapled fanzines that you would get, where you would find about all the underground music that nobody was talking about. But that's how you found out about it,
Absolutely. Yeah, I used to do a magazine like that.
Yeah.
It was all internet, though, but yeah, it was along the same lines. But yeah, so with Believer, I mean, I guess at this point, are we at final thoughts, Joe? Did we make it?
Final thoughts on Believer. Klank Diolosa.
Man, my only final thought is anybody who's never heard of Believer needs to check them out. They're on all over social media, on your streaming sites. They're on CD Baby and Bandcamp and all that. And they're one of my favorite bands, and it's for a reason. You want to know why? Listen to them.
Dan, what about you?
I think Believer is one of those bands that, again, like I said earlier in the episode, if you're into thrash metal and you've never heard Believer, what are you even doing with your life? They're one of the best bands to check out, whether you like Christian music or not. Some people debate as to whether they're Christian music or not. Honestly, it doesn't matter to me. They are one of the bands that you absolutely need to talk about and you need to share with your friends. So yeah, Believer, man, just believe it.
I think Believer is one of the most important, underrated thrash bands that is right in front of your face, but you are not listening to them for some reason. I know, because I was one of those people. I never listened to the band and then found them out of nowhere. Once again, I get to put a band on the list and say, I thought I had all the bands. I clearly did not. Here is Believer playing thrash consistently through their career. So if you're a fan of thrash metal, if you like heavy guitars, if you love double bass drumming, check out Believer. Dan, what's your album of the week?
My album of the week, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to say it. It's Gabriel by Believer. I actually didn't really like it when it came out at first, but it's really grown on me since this listen through.
Klank Diolosa, what about you?
My album of the week, I'm still stuck on, I think it's called The Reckoning by Skold. I'm a Tim Skold fan. It's industrial.
Okay, cool.
I think it's called The Reckoning.
For me, it's Tyrant of Death, Nuclear Nanosecond.
Nice.
What do you do when you've listened to the Doom 2016 soundtrack too much? You listen to the Doom Eternal soundtrack, and then you go home and play Doom Eternal. What do you do after that? You listen to Tyrant of Death.
I'll get right on that.
Well, Klank, thank you so much for talking to us tonight about Believer.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure. I love you guys.
Yep, love you too, man. Have a good night.
Talk to you later.
Take care, brothers.
You too.
Peace.
Thanks again to Klank Diolosa for coming on the show tonight. Klank had to drop out of this episode at the last second, but we got pretty much everything that we could possibly ever want to know about Believer from Klank, and we want to thank you so much, Klank, for coming on the show again. And this will not be the last time you hear from Klank Diolosa.
Take us out, DFT.
If you've ever been listening to our show and thought to yourself, man, I really wish you guys would talk about this other band that you've probably never heard of or never mentioned, send us a message. There's so many different places you can send us a message. That includes Facebook, facebook.com/discography discussion, Twitter @discussmetal. You can send us an email at danandjoeshow@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on our Discord server. There'll be a link in the show notes for that. You can also visit our Teespring store where we have some Discography discussion merch on sale right now.
And on that note, this has been episode 174 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things discography discussion. And please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks.
Give me that money.
$1 a month gets you into that exclusive album review feed.